I think democratisation of the Labor Party and the Labor movement is good for unions, you see, and the reason that I say that is that it gives the rank and file members of the unions that are affiliated to the Labor Party, it gives them a say. And I think there's nothing to fear. I've spent 25 years as a union official. There's nothing to fear by going to people who are union members affiliated to the Labor Party and saying, if you're a Labor voter or a Labor supporter, would you like to have a say in Labor Party affairs? And if so, let's democratise and give them that say. And I'm sure there'd be people in the union movement who might not agree with me about that because perhaps their own influence might be diminished by that. But we've got to look to the greater purpose here, and that's to have as many people as possible involved. When you look at the Labor Party nationally, we've got 40 or 50,000 financial members maybe. If we were to democratise the union involvement in Labor, you might have 1 million people involved, or at least 500,000 people involved. Wouldn't that be better? Well, it's extremely important to being a member of a union. And I don't look at that in a sort of old-fashioned sense. Unions have been creatures of the past as much as they are and can be of the future, and unions need to keep changing. But nonetheless, for individual working people, being part of a collective bargaining process in your workplace is the best way to improve your pay and conditions. Even if you're a relatively highly skilled employee, that can be the case. It's also the way that you ensure health and safety in the workplace, and it's also a way that you can be involved in wider community discussion about important public policy matters. And so for someone in the public service, for example, you might have an interest in the issue of privatisation, and having a relationship with the union's engagement in that can be a way of being involved in policy development. Or if you work in the manufacturing industry, being involved in the union might be a way of having a say in industry policy. And that's been the case for a long time, but this is why I think democratisation is important too. That helps individual people who choose to be a union member have a say in wider public policy. Fabians, I've spoken at lots of Fabians events over a long, long time, decades I suppose, sadly for my age. But the Fabian Society has been an enormously important contributor to public policy debate, the promulgation of values in the labour movement, and supporting intelligent, capable people and their engagement in the Labor Party. And so it's an important institution that I certainly support, and I'd encourage people to be involved. Values and your articulation of them, your commitment to them, living up to that standard, that's the basis for any sort of effective political activity, and particularly organisation behind a political cause. It's driven by values. Everything I've been involved in, whether it's the waterfront dispute or fighting to get people's entitlements after a company collapse or getting compensation for asbestos victims, everything's based on values, articulating that to people in the community and winning their support. And I think that's something that will never change. And therefore, in a changing environment though, it's values that endure. And when people are confronting change, such as the closure of the automotive industry or any other thing of economic significance to people's lives, it's important just to come back to the basic foundations, to think about how to approach the issue. And if you have values of fairness, justice, treatment with respect, dignity, these important basic values always inform how to approach an issue of change. So you've got to look for, from my point of view, the policy mechanisms by which we can improve equality within our community, whether it's inequality that's driven to some degree by discrimination, for example, or whether it's inequality of a social and economic nature that's driven by the lack of opportunity that people have to get ahead. And I'm very passionate about that. With the recent passing of Gough Whitlam, for example, myself, along with many others of my generation, had cause to pause for a moment and think about the contribution of the Whitlam government to improving equality of opportunity through education. Education drives so much for people in a community to be able to get ahead and have the chance to improve your living standard and realise your capabilities. I came from a working class community where no one went to university, no one of my family had been to university previously, and along came Gough Whitlam, and lo and behold, there's free tertiary education made available, and I went to uni. There was still only a couple of us from that area that went to university at that time, but we wouldn't have gone otherwise. Now, you know, there's lots. That's what that change can make. The current government's, you know, turning that backwards. But for the Labor movement, that means if you believe in the equality of opportunity, you must have a position on education that makes it available universally. That doesn't mean you can't have a HECS fee scheme or, you know, an allocation of places, but you've got to have a view that every single person in our community has a right to an education, and put in the policy steps that make that possible for them. Maybe. My take on what you're positing though is that I reckon, for what it's worth, I reckon Gough would say, well, don't worry about my legacy, look at now and look at the future. What have you got to do to make sure that you're true to the values that we articulate and that we hold? And he'd simply say, you know, well, on education, you've got to formulate a policy that delivers equality of opportunity, regardless of your socio-economic background. And on health, same thing. You know, now what's the policies? And how do we get there? And if we've got institutional obstruction within the Labor Party, let's reform it. You know, that's what he did. And, you know, whilst a lot of people look at the achievements of the Whitlam government, some look at the problems of the Whitlam government, you've got to go back a little bit in time to the 60s to look where Gough Whitlam really built the basis for his achievements, and that was party reform and policy reform. And those things, to me, that he did as opposition leader, they were heroic things. He really took on some entrenched institutional power and changed the show and changed it for the better. And people followed because he was a great leader, but it wasn't without a big fight. No, and that's I think that's a really important line to draw. Yes, I compromised on policy positions because I'm pragmatic, and I needed to negotiate things to get things through. And as a union official, that's what it's all about. Negotiation, compromise, being pragmatic, achieving your key goals, but recognising the merits of an argument coming from across the table to you and accommodating it. Compromise is important. But what I'd never compromised on, at least in my mind, maybe someone would have a different view, but as my values. Once you do that, you can see, you know, if you see someone that is compromising on their values, you can see that it erodes them, you know, and diminishes them in political life. And I saw that happen. And it has a bad impact. And you know, it has a bad impact on your political organisation too when that happens. And so I think that's extremely important. Always be mindful of the values that you stand for, articulate them, repeat them, tell yourself, you know, remind yourself when you're in tough situations and live by them, and drive policy from them, but be pragmatic in your policy approach to achieve change. Yes, I do, but I don't regret having left politics. I did so for a number of personal reasons. I'd had 30 years of pretty intense activity in the union movement and in federal parliamentary politics, and a lot of that in quite senior roles. And I had some health issues I needed to attend to, my personal relationships, my family, and a host of other things that you never have time to properly look after if you're at a high level in public life. And So I don't regret my decision to leave, but I'm still very passionate about my beliefs and my values and politics and the labour movement, and so I've looked for ways to try and contribute outside of federal parliament. We were in opposition for 11 years during the Howard years, and there was a point in time, I was in a leadership role in the trade union movement, and there was a point in time where I said to myself, well, you know, bugger this, that the unions have got to take some leadership and try to campaign to get rid of John Howard and try to win the community's support for things, because I felt the Labor Party wasn't responsive to that. And you know, and I think the unions did a good job in that respect and helped defeat John Howard in 2007, and Kevin Rudd certainly had a lot of ideas when he came into government. It is important, fast forwarding to today, that you know, the same sort of lessons we've seen from Gough Whitlam, that party reform, because no one could say that the Labor Party is in the best shape for the future, I think. Party reform and policy reform, particularly economic policy thought, is needed for establishing the basis for victory and for having a program when we're in government. That's very important to get on with. I reckon, you know, economic growth is the foundation for the labour movement to improve social equity, social justice. You've got to have economic growth, and therefore you've got to look to the economic policy context that will support greater growth. And there are a lot of obvious answers to that, but there are, you know, shibboleths for the labour movement to continue to come up against. For example, free trade agreements. You've got to look at it through a lens of, well, you know, is it going to support the growth of our economy? And demonstrably, the policy reforms that have opened our economy up, that were labour reforms, that were controversial over the last quarter of a century, they have opened the economy, driven economic growth, improved living standards. Yes, it was difficult for many working people that we represent. They lost their jobs in industries that declined, but jobs and educational opportunities opened up that changed the composition of the workforce and gave people a better chance and improved their living standard. That's a long, difficult process, but I think we've got to kind of tackle that again, essentially. There are new economic drivers, there's rapid technological change, and rather than resist it, we've got to embrace it and think about how to utilise it to drive social change and to improve social equality as well. If we don't have a growing economy and a growing tax base, you can't invest in education, health and other important reforms like the National Disability Insurance Scheme. And so that's why I think that's what joins those two things. Your values underpin it, and you know, as the economy changes, such as with the closure of the auto industry, you think about how to support people in that change. That's an important part of your economic policy. One of the ways to support them is through skills and training so that they can participate in the labour force. So that's the way I look at that. But sometimes when the labour movement's in opposition, you know, it tends to retreat a bit from that open economic philosophy that stood us in good stead for the last 25 years. And I don't think that's necessarily a progressive thing. Well, there's been many. The overall fight of my life is, like so many thousands of others in the labour movement, is fighting for my values. Finding a way that I can be engaged with others who share my values to pursue fairness and justice in our society. And that's not an easy thing to do. I mean, at a personal level, you make choices not to do that sort of paid employment, to try and find paid employment if you can within the labour movement, or you be an activist at a voluntary level. You know, to try and do that involves some hard choices. And then when you become involved in a cause and a campaign, whether it's for pay and conditions, health and safety or something else in your workplace, all that's very difficult for lots of people. And My book, The Fights of My Life, is a sort of story of my engagement in that way, and I've had the privilege of being involved in a lot of union campaigns, industrial disputes, the waterfront dispute, the collapse of Ansett, the James Hardie asbestos compensation campaign, the Rights at Work campaign, then in Parliament, in lots of different things, including the battle over climate change and carbon pricing policy. You know, for me, that's a continuum. It's not a grab bag of different things. It's a continuum of activism, and I suppose the message I wanted to put to people is, if you want to achieve good things and be true to your values, you've got to fight hard. You know, it's not easy. There's always someone opposing you, and you've got to fight hard to get there. I reckon the future for the Labor Party is really good, but it's never had a future without people fighting for it. You know, and that means fighting for it in a general political sense to gain democratic support, but also fighting for its future within the Labor Party, to have a vibrant, culture of contesting ideas, constructively resolving contested ideas, getting policy outcomes, being clear and articulating values, reforming the internal structures so that they're, genuinely democratic. Coming from the New South Wales branch of the Labor Party, I can't emphasise enough how important that is, the internal issue, because as has been seen there, when it's not democratic, in its functioning, and it's dominated by particular factional interests who become self-serving, are not accountable, are not transparent, you can get corruption, and certainly ethically corrupt conduct, if not criminally corrupt. And there's a big lesson to be drawn there. You've got to take power out of the hands of a few people and devolve it to those who are genuinely committed to the cause, give them a say in the show, and I think that's the best way for the future. The fight for the future of the environment and the battle, to tackle climate change is germane to Labor's cause. And if you again reduce it to a values issue, I think it's the biggest issue of intergenerational equity that I've ever conceived. We've got no right, as far as I'm concerned, to consume all the resources now and enrich our lives and deny future generations, the economic growth that can be drawn upon, and to deny them access to what we're enjoying in terms of the environment now. That's unfair. That offends my values, and it's one of the reasons that I've been very committed to dealing with climate change. And Penny Wong and I, of course, served as ministers in the Rudd and Gillard governments dealing with it. And I know Penny Wong was, as passionate, if not more, about the issue. And therefore, I think it's fundamentally important to Labor's cause. We lost the carbon pricing argument. Tony Abbott decisively defeated us in the retail politics of that, but he didn't defeat the policy integrity, and the work that Penny and I did in the Rudd and Gillard governments for carbon pricing, that will come back as a consequence of future policy debates. We don't believe that work to be wasted. And besides that, people say to me, well, you must feel very down about, and I don't feel down about Abbott having won that election and repealing the carbon price legislation. I know from my lifetime of working experience for the Labor movement that you have to fight and have to fight again, and especially for really big reforms, you've got to keep fighting until you win it, and it's embedded. Just think if the Labor Party had given up, for example, after the defeat of the Whitlam government and the repeal of Medibank, which was a monumental achievement, monumental. It took years before Labor won again, another 8 years' time before the election of the Hawke government, and then a bit more time for Hawke to successfully legislate Medicare. This is of that nature, and you've got to stay true to it, keep fighting for it, articulate it, win the support of the community and embed it, and we'll win that, I've got no doubt about it.